We'll do the screen share. Let's see. Okay, the PowerPoint that I was doing is no longer there, so hold on just a second. And I will open it. All right. Okay, can you see the screen, the PowerPoint? Okay, is it working? Thumbs up? Okay, good. All right, now let us try it. Theology. We're not going to go into Jewish theology to any great extent. We'll only mention three basic beliefs of the Jewish people. N.T. Wright says that the entire theological worldview of Judaism of the first century can be summarized in these three beliefs. Number one, monotheism. This is the belief in one God. This is the most basic and important of all Jewish beliefs. It doesn't mean that the Jews worshiped one God among many, but it means that they deny the very existence of other gods. There is only one who is capable of being called God, only one who qualifies, and that is Yahweh, the Lord. Every synagogue service began with the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, which begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Many times in Isaiah, we read, "I am the Lord," or "I am God, and there is no other." This is a basic belief of the Jewish people, monotheism. Secondly, we have election. This is the belief that God chose Abraham and his descendants as his special people. Unfortunately, this was viewed in terms of privilege very often rather than responsibility. Rather than being a light to the Gentiles, they became an enemy of the Gentiles. And then thirdly, eschatology. Eschatology is the belief that God has a plan for this world and that he is working it out in the present. There is a future for the people of God. Now, this was unique in the ancient Near East. In the other cultures, time was viewed as cyclical in nature, that the events of the world just sort of repeated over and over and over again. The Jewish people believed that God was leading this world to a destiny, that it was going somewhere, and that we could make a change in this world for the future. Of course, eschatology is very important for the New Testament. Now, when we think in terms of eschatology, I guess I ought to say eschatology means the study of the last things. Eschatos in Greek is last, and ology, the study of. So the study of the last things. Very often when we think of eschatology, we think of the second coming, the rapture, the Antichrist, the millennium, the tribulation, and all of that. But actually, the whole New Testament is an eschatological book. When Jesus came saying the time is fulfilled, repent and believe the good news, he was making eschatological statements. Now the time of the fulfillment of the prophecies is coming to pass. The fulfillment is coming now. God is doing a work in our world. N.T. Wright summarizes it like this. There is one creator God who has chosen Israel to be his people, giving her his Torah and establishing her in his holy land. He will act for her and through her to reestablish his judgment and justice, his wisdom and his shalom, peace, throughout the world. Okay, any questions or comments on this little brief treatment of Jewish theology?
Sir,
Yes.
just one request. I think one of our classmates is still waiting for you to let him in. It's Daniel Soga.
Let me see here. I'm not getting a message that there's anyone waiting. I normally get a message at the top of the screen telling me that, but I'm not getting one. I don't, it's not indicating that anybody is waiting to be admitted.
Sir, do you have the option to click on participants? Because that will show you if there's anyone waiting to be admitted.
Okay, let me try that. Okay, I have Luisa here. But you said Daniel?
Yes, sir, Daniel. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Got him.
Thank you,
Got
sir.
him. All right. Well, thank you all for bearing with me during my learning curve. All right. Any questions or comments about the content of what we're dealing with here?
Sir, I just want to affirm that it's really God's dealing with Israel is really unique, because when we consider all the other nations, is one creator God, not just that he's the one creator God, but he deals with his people on a personal basis, like with the quotation. It's so wonderful to think about that. Very unique when we study all the religion of the other nations in Near East.
It
strengthens our
You're
faith.
Right.
Yeah.
You're right. And if you want to see the uniqueness, compare the Genesis creation narrative with the creation narrative of the other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And you can see we're in a completely different ballpark here. It's completely different. Yeah. Thank you, Alvin.
Greek mythologies, Greek gods are very confusing in all the other nations. So yeah, right, when you their stories and they're dealing with people so confused.
Yeah.
That is right.
Sir, I believe that it's unique. They are unique because there is a purpose, a specific purpose for Israel. That I believe that's one reason why they are unique, because God has a specific purpose for Israel and that nation that He Himself has founded. Yes,
you're right.
Genesis
You're right.
Chapter 12. Anyway, yeah.
And that purpose is, in a sense, to undo the work of Adam, the fall, to bring redemption.
Right, sir.
And he chose to do that, choosing one man, and through his family, redemption would come. Now, it didn't come the way it may have come. It came through one descendant, and that is Jesus Christ. When Israel did not fulfill what they were supposed to do, the perfect Israelite did it, and that is through Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God. Yeah.
Question, please.
Yes.
As you mentioned, is it because of we Gentiles why God changed all this situation? Is it because if it's like what you said, if it's for Israel, surely there will be no Gentile saved.
Yeah, yes, it was, Israel was to be God's instrument, his instrument for reconciliation. You are a light to the Gentiles, Isaiah says. But unfortunately, very often they weren't a light. They were the enemies. And but look at all the places in the Old Testament where it is prophesied that the Gentiles will worship God, worship Yahweh, come to Jerusalem. And that is fulfilled in Christ, where no longer is it simply Israel that is the people of God, but now it is opened up to anyone who has faith in God, like Abraham, so that we become the true children of Abraham, and it is opened up to people of all races, all colors, all languages, all everything. After all, how many of us would be saved if it were just for the Jews? You know, none of us. But God opened it up through Jesus Christ for the whole world. So Israel did become a light to the Gentiles through Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's go on. The temple. The Jews had 3 temples or 2 temples, depending on how you do your reckoning there, in succession. First of all, there was Solomon's temple. It was built in 950 BC in the 11th year of Solomon's reign. And Solomon's temple was certainly spectacular. It was destroyed, however, in 586 when the Babylonians invaded Israel. It's estimated that if Solomon's temple were built today, it would cost between 150 and 200 billion US dollars. It was a magnificent building. It was built by Solomon, prepared for by David, but actually built by Solomon, and we call it Solomon's Temple. Then we come to the Second Temple. The Second Temple was built after the return from exile between the years 537 and 516 BC. We know very little about this temple. Certainly in splendor, it was much inferior to Solomon's temple. The Ark of the Covenant was taken or destroyed in the exile, and it disappeared from the pages of history, Indiana Jones notwithstanding. Have any of you seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, that movie? Anybody seen it? Cassidy has? Okay, Rebecca, Ethel, okay. Exciting movie. Yeah, I would recommend that you see it. But there it shows us where the temple is. It's in a big warehouse in Washington, D.C. Well, not really. Not really. So the Holy of Holies did not have the ark in it. This temple stood for almost 500 years, longer than either Solomon's temple or Herod's temple. The Second Temple was never violently destroyed. It was replaced section by section by Herod's temple. And so then we have Herod's temple. Herod began reconstructing the temple in 19 or 20 BC. For a year and a half, the construction of the sanctuary itself went on with the work being done by priests. Only priests could go into the holy place. And so Herod conscripted them as construction workers, and they were the ones who built the sanctuary. The process of building it took many years. That's why the Jews could say to Jesus, "It has taken 46 years to build the temple, and are you going to raise it in 3 days?" John 2:20. Now, Herod's temple must have been a spectacular sight to see. It was white marble, partially covered with gold. By the time Herod had finished the temple, it was the largest religious building in the world. 140,000 square meters. And that included the courtyard. Huge building made by Herod. Philo said the buildings of it are of most exceeding beauty and magnificence, so as to be universal objects of admiration to all who behold them, and especially to all foreigners who travel to those parts, and who, comparing them with their own public edifices, marvel both at the beauty and sumptuousness of this one. Ephesus was known for the Temple of Artemis, which was like one of the wonders of the world. When people went to Ephesus, they were amazed by this temple. But I think when Paul went to Ephesus, he probably wasn't all that impressed, because he had seen the temple in Jerusalem, and that probably outshone the Temple of Artemis by a long shot. So it was an amazing, amazing building. Now, here is a visual comparison of Solomon's temple with Herod's temple. And you can see the difference in size between the two. The temple was made up of several sections. First of all, the court of the Gentiles. This was part where anybody could go. Whether you were a Jew or a Gentile, anybody could go into this part. This is probably the area where Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers, because it would be an open place, a place of business where worshipers who came, who couldn't bring an animal from their far off home, would come and purchase an animal at a very inflated price and be able to offer sacrifice that way. Next, we come to the temple proper. This was restricted to Jews, and a sign has been discovered that hung in the temple. This is it. This is in the Israeli Museum, and it says, "No man of another nation to enter within the fence and enclosure round the temple, and whoever is caught will have himself to blame that his death ensues." In other words, you go into the temple, you die. Capital punishment, punishment by death. Now, as part of the temple, we have, first of all, the outer court, called the women's court. And this is where the women could go. They could go that far. And then the court of the Israelites. This is where the men could go. And then the court of the priests. So it's realized the farther in we go, the holier the space as we go in. And then we have the sanctuary, which is made up of the porch, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. Now, the terminology here varies from person to person. Here, I am calling the sanctuary this whole inner part that has these three parts. Other people call the holy place the sanctuary. So as you're reading about this, you have to keep in mind that, well, you've got to try to keep it straight. Here is a little schematic here, a little map of what it would look like. If you go way to the far right, you can't see much of it, but out there is the court of the Gentiles. That is a very large part of the temple complex. And then we have here on the right side, the women's court. So any Israelite could go there. And then if we go farther to the left, we have this narrow part called the court of the Israelites, or the men's court. And then beyond that, we have the court of the priests. And then this black square looking thing here, you could call the whole thing the sanctuary. On this map, the holy place is called the sanctuary. As we go in from the right, we have the porch, and then the sanctuary or the holy place, and then within that, the Holy of Holies. So the Holy of Holies was the place where the high priest would go once a year to offer sacrifices for himself and for the people. He would go in, he would sprinkle the Ark of the Covenant when it was there. He would sprinkle that with blood. And that would be on the Day of Atonement. One day a year. Okay. Yes, Alvin?
Sir,
Somebody
Sir-
needs to mute themselves.
yeah.
Okay.
Sir, two questions.
Yes.
First, about Herod's temple, did Herod get it right? I mean, comparing to the Solomon's temple, is it generally basically the same in terms of structure, in terms of the Solomon's temple, though bigger? And number two, there was no Ark of the Covenant at Herod's temple, right? At that
That's
time.
right. That's right. Right. Yeah, I think he got it right. You know, I have not read of Jews saying he didn't get it right, although there were a lot of Jews who denounced the temple because of the corruption of the high priests, and especially the Essenes. They saw the temple as being totally corrupt. But I don't think it was because of the building. It was rather because of the corruption of the people that were running it. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions here?
So, sir, it's me, sir.
Yes,
So,
Louis.
Herod's temple, is it the second temple, or
Well,
the Solomon's temple was
Mhm.
rebuilt,
Mhm.
and this would be the third temple, or the? Sorry, I got mixed up.
Okay, that's understandable because it is confusing.
Yeah.
There are two ways of reckoning. One is that there are three temples: Solomon's temple, the second temple, and Herod's temple.
Okay.
The other way of reckoning is that there are two temples: Solomon's temple and the second temple. Okay, so they don't count Herod's temple as a third temple. In fact, this time period, all the way to AD 70, is called Second Temple Judaism.
Thank you.
You can look at it in either way, that there are two temples or there are three temples. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
So, sir,
Mhm.
it was this Herod's temple was built atop the second temple, right? You were saying that he took the second temple piece by piece and replaced the structure.
That's
So
right.
then this was the same one that the Romans destroyed in 70 AD.
That's
It's
right.
actually Herod's temple. Okay.
That's
thank
right.
you, sir.
That's right. Okay, any other questions? Okay, here is a possible way that the temple looked. I'll just show you a few drawings as people have tried to illustrate what it may have looked like. This would be a reconstruction of Herod's temple, and you'll see this large outside area is the temple of the court of the Gentiles, and then within that you get into the temple proper. This is the way the Temple Mount looks today. The dome of the mosque, the dome of the rock there, that Muslim mosque, is sitting where the temple used to be. Here is the Western Wall, or it's called the Wailing Wall by some. This is the retaining wall of the temple. It's not the temple itself. The temple itself was completely destroyed. You know, Jesus said not one stone would be left on another, and he was right. The Romans did a complete job. But part of the retaining wall is still there. And the Jews go there to pray. They'll take a little piece of paper and they'll write their prayer on the paper and they'll stick it between the blocks there. And, you know, there's a tradition that if you do that, your prayer is going to be answered. Well, it's probably not true, but that is the tradition. And so this is people who have come here to pray here at the Western Wall. This is the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. And notice the steps on the far left. In the first century, that was the main entrance into the temple. If you want to go to a place where you can say, almost certainly Jesus was here, that would be one of the places. Because almost certainly Jesus walked up those very steps going into the temple. Okay. The coins that were used in the temple were the Tyrian half shekel. And here is a picture of the Tyrian half shekel. So this is the coinage from Tyre, a Gentile country up on the coast, north of Israel. They use the half shekel as the currency for the temple. It's rather interesting. They use coins with pagan imagery on them in the temple. Rather strange kind of thing, but they use different kinds of coins, and we'll go into that in our next section.
Question, please.
Yes.
Is that the coin, what do you say, is that the coin that Jesus ordered Peter to go and grab it from the mouth of the fish and
Yes.
give it to the priest?
Yes. That's what that was. It was the Tyrian half shekel.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Here I just have what Louisa asked about. The reckoning of three temples is not universal. Many consider Herod's temple not as a third temple, but as an extension of the second temple. In fact, this period of Judaism up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is called Second Temple Judaism. Okay. Let's look at the synagogue. The synagogue became a key element in the preservation of Judaism. It was the social and educational center of Jewish life at the time of Christ. So during the time of the temple, there were also synagogues. So they were, you might say side by side, except synagogues were throughout the Roman Empire. There was only one temple, and that was in Jerusalem. Now, after the temple was destroyed, the synagogues continued. So in the temple, we have ritual sacrifice. In the synagogue, we have the study of the law. In the temple, the priest is the key person. In the synagogue, the rabbi is the key person. In the temple, it is the communal faith, whereas in the synagogue, the stress is on the individual life. The personnel of the synagogue, there was a head of the synagogue ruler, and he was the worship leader. And there was also a synagogue attendant, and he was like the custodian of the things that were in the synagogue, the property that they had there. In their order of worship, they first of all had an invocation, that is the prayer, asking God to bless their time. They had the reading of a psalm as a call to worship. And then they had the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and the reading of the 10 Commandments. They then had the Barakot, or the 18 benedictions. Barakot means blessing. They had the reading of scriptures, followed by a sermon. We have this in Luke, where Jesus goes to Nazareth and he asks them to turn to Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has called me to preach the gospel to the poor, that entire passage there. And his message is, today this is fulfilled in your hearing. And then we have a blessing or a prayer if no priest was present.
That reading of the scripture by Jesus was in the synagogue,
Yes,
not
it
the
was.
temple.
That's right. It was in the synagogue. The
Thank you.
synagogue in Nazareth. Right. The synagogue had a tremendous influence upon the church. In fact, it has been said that Christian worship in its New Testament form was the result of the fusion of the synagogue and the upper room. So it was patterned after the worship of the synagogue, but we also have the Lord's Supper, and that comes from the upper room.
Sure.
Yes,
Dr. Galen.
yes, Alvin.
Seeing the flow of the worship in the synagogue, then in the last paragraph we said that the New Testament worship would kind of infused with upper room worship. As I saw, because I've been involved with liturgical churches also, the mainline denominations,
Mhm.
kind of their pattern of liturgical worship kind of the same, except with some of the benedictions are hymns that we sing. So a little bit
Okay.
similar to this. Just a observation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, let us look at the Jews' sacred year. And here we're going to look at the major festivals. The Jews used two calendars simultaneously. The same time, they used two different calendars, the civil year and the cultic year, or cultic. By cultic, we mean sacred or religious. The civil year began in October with Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's, and the religious or cultic year began in the spring at Passover. Now, you know the church operates on two calendars as well. The civil calendar starts on January 1st, and that's the one that we probably all use. But the church year begins with the Advent season, which is 4 Sundays before Christmas. Let me ask you, do any of your churches celebrate the church year? Any of them? Alvin,
With some
maybe?
of the churches I've been involved with,
Okay.
UCCP, the Church of Christ, Methodist, liturgical.
Okay. Okay.
I have attended some.
Okay. Most of us only
Yeah, they have a
celebrate.
calendar year.
Yeah, most of us only celebrate Christmas and Easter. Those are the only, or maybe Pentecost. And those are about all that most of our churches celebrate. Okay, let us pause here for a 10-minute break, and we will see you in 10 minutes. All right. Uh, the Passover was the celebration of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt. It was the most important of all the Jewish feasts. Our Easter falls in the Passover season. Pentecost, or Feast of Weeks. Pentecost gets its name because it takes place 50 days after Passover. The Greek word is Pentekonta. It marked the completion of the barley harvest and was at times called the Feast of Harvest or the Day of First Fruits. It was a time of joy and thanksgiving for God's blessings. In intertestamental times, it came to be associated with the giving of the law on Sinai. The Feast of Trumpets. This was the beginning of the Jewish civil year, a time of general rejoicing. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The Day of Atonement came 9 days after Rosh Hashanah. It was a holy, solemn day, the only day of the year that the high priest entered the Holy of Holies and offered sacrifices for the people. It was also the day that the scapegoat was driven into the desert, symbolically carrying away the people's sins. So this was the most holy day for the Jewish people. I remember when I was a kid, there was a baseball player for the Los Angeles Dodgers by the name of Sandy Koufax, and he was a Jew. And it was during the World Series, the time when they determined who was the greatest baseball team. But he wouldn't pitch on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. He refused to play on that day because of his Jewish religion. The Feast of Tabernacles. Sukkot, also called the Festival of Booths or the Festival of Ingathering. This feast served as a reminder of the Jews sojourning in the wilderness. At the feast, they lived in booths or huts made of the boughs of trees and palm branches. It also celebrated the close of harvest. The Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah, also called the Feast of Dedication. How many of you in your country, they celebrate Hanukkah? Is that a holiday in your country? Okay, maybe because there aren't too many Jews in your country. In America, there are 3 holidays in December. Christmas, Hanukkah for the Jews, and Kwanzaa for the African Americans, the Black people. Of the 7 feasts, this is the only one that is intertestamental in origin. It was established in 164 BC when Judas Maccabeus recaptured and cleansed the temple after it had been defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes. It is celebrated about the time of Christmas. Jesus celebrated this festival as recorded in John 10:22. So did you know Jesus celebrated Hanukkah? He did. And then we have the Feast of
Excuse me,
Purim.
sir.
Question?
Excuse me.
Yes.
Yeah. Should we celebrate this Hanukkah?
I don't
This
think we would be obligated to celebrate Hanukkah or any of the Jewish feasts because we're not under the law anymore. And, if you want to, you can. If you want to adopt a Jewish lifestyle, just don't think that that's going to affect your salvation, because it's not. But we all come from different cultures. If yours happen to be a Jewish culture, that would be great. Or if you want to adopt a Jewish culture, you can do it. It's not going to improve your spiritual life, probably, unless it helps you understand better, what the New Testament is about, or Old Testament. But I don't think we're forbidden to celebrate those, but neither are we obligated to celebrate them.
In the Philippines, sir, there are some Christian churches who are very, how should I say it, close to some of the Jewish feasts and the things that they do. They're Christian churches, but they're very Jewish in the things that they do, but they're Filipino.
Yeah.
They highlight the feasts.
Right. And my only question is, why do you do that?
I don't know. I don't know why they do that.
Do you think it's going to get you closer to God? Well, it's not.
No.
It's not. And,
but sir, some of the Muslims, the Muslims, they're very strong in celebrating these special rituals in their religion. Like they celebrate a lot of these feasts and these special. Yeah, even if they live here in New Zealand or wherever they live, they still honor those feasts.
Yes.
I've been invited to some of these feasts.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they revolve around Muhammad and their version of the sacrifice of Abraham's son Ishmael
to their own God.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And as Christians, we don't have what you would call holy days. I mean, we celebrate Easter, but it's not a Christian rule that you have to celebrate Easter if you're going to be a Christian. In fact, Paul said that he was worried about I believe it's the Galatians, that they were celebrating holy days. And he said also, if you're circumcised, of course, that's for religious reasons, then Christ is of no value to you. So we don't become better Christians by adopting a Jewish lifestyle.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to do it, well, fine, but just don't think it's going to be spiritually necessary for your salvation at all. Okay?
That's right.
Okay. There was a tradition which gave rise to the Feast of Lights, Hanukkah, that when they dedicated the temple, they ran out of oil for the lamps. And so they prayed, and God supplied the oil and allowed the lamps to burn for the 8 days as a miraculous thing. So that is a tradition and gave rise to the Feast of Lights, Hanukkah. And they have a special lampstand, the menorah. And you can tell that it's the Hanukkah menorah because it has 9 places for 9 candles or 9 lamps, rather than the normal 7 that the Jewish menorah has. Okay, the Feast of Purim. The origin of this feast is recorded in Esther 9. It comes from the word meaning lots. It was a national holiday on which the book of Esther was read. Okay, so those are the 7 festivals of the Jewish religion that they kept throughout the year. Do you have any questions or comments here before we go on? All right. One thing that we need to deal with here to understand the culture, especially in which Jesus lived, is that of the concept of purity. To approach a holy God, one had to be holy and ritually clean. Every society has its standards for purity, and it varies from culture to culture. That's probably one thing that living on the APTS campus, one thing that makes it so unique, so interesting, is that you have people from 30 different cultures living on one campus. And sometimes those cultures bump up against each other. They don't go well with each other. And so you have to just sort of tolerate people and try to understand them, even though maybe you can't understand them. But purity is one of those things. How often do you take a shower or a bath? You know, when I grew up, my parents said, you always wash your hands after you go to the bathroom and before you eat. Certainly after you go to the bathroom, and if you can, before you eat, you know? And I don't see why everybody doesn't go by those standards, you know, but they don't. We have students at APTS who come from cultures where they don't take baths very often. And, you know, they can walk into the room and I don't even have to see them. I know they're there by the smell. I think by the time they leave, they have adapted to more frequent showers. But, you know, we all have standards of purity. Now, the Jews didn't distinguish moral laws from ritual laws. The same sacrifices were made for both moral and ritual offenses. For the Jews, there were some things that were holy and some things that were profane. To approach a holy God, a person had to be ceremonially clean. Some things were clean, some things were unclean, and the unclean could not be in the presence of God. When you read Leviticus, you'll see all kinds of regulations for purity. You know, this can make you unclean, you know, bodily excretions, you know, liquids that flow from your body can make you unclean. Mold, mildew in your house is unclean and you have to take care of it, maybe even tear down the house. To touch a dead body would make you unclean. Or to touch a person who had touched a dead body could make you unclean. Eating with a Gentile or eating in a Gentile's home would make you unclean. Now imagine it as spiritual COVID, okay? Spiritual COVID. It can be transmitted from one unclean person to a clean person and make that clean person unclean. So lepers, since they were unclean, had to stay apart from other people. Now, the Pharisees of the first century applied purity rituals that were designed only for priests. They applied it to everyone. Wright and Bird say, for them, all of life had to be lived as if one were in the temple in the very presence of God. Now, it wasn't normally that way until a few years before the birth of Jesus. And then this great call for purity came about. In New Testament times, an important ritual for purity was a ritual bath. Wherever archaeologists have discovered first century Jewish homes, they have discovered these ritual baths. The ritual baths are called mikvaot, and the singular of that is mikveh. Outside the temple, there are many mikvaot. And here is a picture of one of them. So the person would take off his clothes, her clothes, walk down, wash themselves in the the bath there and come out. And they had separate areas for men to bathe and for women to bathe. It was believed that while ceramic and wooden vessels could become unclean, stone vessels could not. So stone vessels were the preferred vessels that the Jews used. In John 2, we are told of Jesus turning water into wine. And it says specifically in verse 6 that the jars that were used were stone jars. And the jars probably looked very much like these jars from the first century. These are made of stone. It is very soft stone. Some people call it chalk, although it is more substantial than our chalk that we use today. But it could be turned on a lathe, and you could turn it on a lathe and you could make it into the shape that you wanted. And so the vessels that Jesus used to turn the water into wine probably look very much like this. Other smaller vessels like cups and bowls were also made of stone. We read in the New Testament about the Pharisees demanding that the disciples of Jesus wash their hands before eating. Now, it wasn't that they were concerned about the transmission of disease. It was rather a religious concern. And Mark says, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. And the ceremony that they went through in doing this was very detailed. And if they missed one part of it, they had to start all over and go through this whole ritual, letting the water go down to their elbows and then letting it go down to their fingertips. And it was very complicated. Now, notice in the Gospels that when the leper asked Jesus to heal him, he doesn't say, heal me. He says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Clean. He's talking about a religious thing here. Jesus doesn't say, be healed. He says, be clean. And he was healed and he was made clean. Jesus redefined purity. His disciples didn't always wash their hands, at least not according to the ritual of the Pharisees before eating. Jesus said that he was Lord over the Sabbath. He called the temple, the most holy place for Jews, a den of robbers. And Jesus wasn't afraid of becoming defiled. You see, to touch a person with leprosy would make you defiled. It would make you unclean. But Jesus touched lepers and he wasn't defiled. Rather, they were made clean. When the woman with the issue of blood reached out and touched his garment and was healed, remember Jesus said, who touched me? She would have been making him unclean by doing that because she was unclean. But in the process, she was healed and she became clean, and Jesus did not become unclean. When Jesus touched the young man who had died, he didn't become unclean. Rather, the young man was raised to life. In the Old Testament, the unclean makes the clean unclean. In the New Testament, the clean makes the unclean clean. One person has said it's as if cleanliness is contagious. even in a marriage, when a Christian is married to a non-Christian, Paul says that the unbelieving spouse is made holy by the believer, and their children are not unclean, but are clean. When that Christian wife raises her children for God, Paul says they are clean. They are not unclean. So for the Christian, purity is more internal than external. But internal purity is going to show itself in a holy life. Okay, do you have questions here before we go on?
Is that the same process when Jesus performed washing the disciples' feet? Is it a sign of purity or the sign of what do you call servant sort of thing?
Yeah, I believe you're right there on the last thing you said, Elise. It wasn't a religious ceremony that Jesus was doing. Jesus was taking on the role of a servant. It was a lesson in humility. So, yeah, this didn't really have anything to do with religious purity, but it had everything to do with the kind of lifestyle that Jesus' disciples should live. It is that of humility.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? All right. Let us look at Judaism's literature. There are three classifications of literature that the Jews in the New Testament era had. First of all, they had the Old Testament scriptures in Hebrew. The scriptures, of course, were their Bible. It was the early church's Bible. And it was divided into three parts. You can see here three columns. One is the law or Torah. That is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch. In the next column, we have the prophets, the Nevi'im. And there were 2 divisions of this: the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book the 12, or what we would call the minor prophets. Notice that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are prophets. Now, today we would put them in our English Bibles, we would categorize them as history, but not so in the Hebrew Bible. And then the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets, as we call them. And then in the third column, we have the writings, the Ketuvim. And we have here the poetic books, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, the 5 scrolls, the Megillot, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And the historical books, which are Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So this is the division of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. When I was in seminary, we had to take 3 Old Testament core courses. The first one was called Pentateuch and Former Prophets. So it covered Genesis through 2 Kings. The next course that we took was on latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. And then the third course that we took was writings. And all of those in the third column are what we studied in that class. Also notice Samuel is only 1 book, Kings is only 1 book, Chronicles is only 1 book. We divide them into 2. Ezra, Nehemiah was one book. All right. Next, we have the Old Testament scriptures in Greek. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament, abbreviated as LXX, also was widely used in the Greek-speaking world. It was the main version used by the Greek-speaking authors of the New Testament. As you look at the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, there's really no evidence that he even was familiar or could read the Hebrew Old Testament. He used the Septuagint. There's a tradition that the Septuagint was translated in 72 days by 72 authors. And it actually was probably written over many, many years, translated over many, many years. Also, the Septuagint had many different forms. It's not like you could go down to the bookstore and, say, hey, I want a Septuagint, and they would give you a book. Rather, there were different forms. Of course, they used scrolls, but there were different translations. So it was sort of fluid during the New Testament times. But it was basically the main Bible of the early church, even more so than the Hebrew scriptures. The oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Septuagint are contained in the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus. And the books of the Old Testament in those manuscripts are given here. Now, you don't have to memorize these at all, but just to show you what is here, some of these contained for example, Daniel and Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, Tobit, Judith, First Esdras. Those are works that we're going to talk about in just a minute called the Apocrypha. Now, those books did not appear in the Hebrew Bible. They appeared in the Septuagint, the Greek translation. So let's go to that right now, the Apocrypha. There are several works which were written after the Hebrew scriptures, which were used by Jews in the first century and have been used by the church since that time. This is the Old Testament Apocrypha. Apocryphal books appear in several of the Greek codices of the Old Testament and New Testament from the 4th and 5th centuries. So notice that it's not in the Hebrew scriptures, but it is in the Septuagint. The Apocrypha today is part of the Roman Catholic Bible. Protestants don't see it as being all that valuable, and we certainly don't see it as being inspired. Now, there are stories there that are edifying, some of them. By reading the Apocrypha, you can get important historical information, but these are not inspired and they are not part of our Bible. Here is a listing of the books in the Apocrypha as given in the Revised Standard Version and the New American Bible. You can see that there is some variation of the titles, the names, but they are the same books. Now, there is another category of post-Old Testament books called the pseudepigrapha. These works were mostly late in origin, and some were discovered at Qumran. Some of these works were apocalyptic in nature. Let me just show you a listing of the works in the pseudepigrapha. These are divided by the type of literature. Here we have apocalyptic literature and related works. So these are apocalypses. The style is similar to that of our book of Revelation, with vivid imagery, beasts, multiple heads and horns, that kind of thing. We have testaments, and the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, the testament of Job, that kind of thing. Of course, the 12 patriarchs did not write these testaments. Job did not write this testament. These are what we call pseudepigraphical. It is written in the name of someone else. So they take one of the heroes of the Bible and put that name on their writings. Expansions of the Old Testament and legends, wisdom and philosophical literature, prayers, psalms, and odes, fragments of Judeo-Hellenistic works. Okay, we'll leave the pseudepigrapha there. Now, in your syllabus, you have a link to both the Apocrypha and the pseudepigrapha online. So if you would like to look at those, you can follow those links. We also had the Dead Sea Scrolls, documents from an Essene community in Qumran near the Dead Sea in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. Now, this is a picture that I took of Cave 4. There are 11 caves. In fact, within just the last couple of years, they have discovered a 12th cave. But back in 1947, a shepherd threw a rock into a cave and he heard something break. And so they went and discovered that there were large jars, pottery jars. And in the jars, they had these scriptures. Probably what happened was that after the Jewish Revolution, the Romans were coming to Qumran, and in order to preserve their scriptures, they put them in jars and hid them in the caves. So from the year around probably 74 AD until 1947, those jars have been in there. So it's like getting into a time capsule and going back. And I remember when these were first discovered, there were people saying, new discoveries have been made that are going to disprove the Bible. Well, in fact, the opposite happened. Until this time, the oldest manuscript of the Hebrew Bible was from about the year 1000 years after Christ. But here we have portions of scripture from the time of Christ. And it shows us that those Hebrew manuscripts have very accurately been preserved over that time. So we don't have to worry about the accuracy of of our Old Testament, the manuscripts that went into our Old Testament. This is a photo of a small portion of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls there. In Jerusalem, they have a whole museum dedicated. It's called the Book of the Scroll. And you can go in there. Unfortunately, they won't let you take pictures, but you can go in there and you can view some of the actual Dead Sea Scrolls. Another piece of literature from the Jewish people was the Talmud. The scribes, who became experts at the interpretation of scripture, made comments on passages, and this commentary was collected into a body of teachings called the Talmud. Now, the Talmud has two different parts. There's the Mishnah which is commentary over the oral law, and the Gemara, which is the interpretation of the oral law. And this is further divided into two kinds of writings. The Halakha dealt with the law code, and the Haggadah dealt with everything else. Now, I'm not going to ask you about this, so you're not going to be responsible for knowing about these different kinds of Jewish writings. But there are two other sets of documents that I would like to mention here. One is the writings of Josephus. Josephus lived in the 1st century AD, and he wrote several documents that give us insight into Judaism at that time. He was a Jew who adopted many of the ways of life of the Romans. In fact, he lived in an apartment in the Roman emperor's home. So he was really friendly with the Romans. His 4 works are Vita, or Life, telling about his life, the Jewish War, which tells about the war of the Jews against the Romans ending in AD 70. The Jewish Antiquities tells the history of the Jewish people, and also a work called Against Apion, which was a defense of Judaism. Josephus is extremely important. Most of what we know about the history of the Jews in the 1st century comes from Josephus. And the other person is Philo. Philo was a 1st century Jew from a very wealthy family in Alexandria. He had a role in the government, but he's primarily known for his writings. Most of his writings are exegetical, being expositions of the Pentateuch. He combines literal and allegorical interpretation, but the stress is on the allegorical. So, with allegorical interpretation, it's very difficult to establish the fact that this is what the author meant, because you're really importing other meanings into that. Now, Philo was innocent. He wanted to do a good thing. He wanted to make the Old Testament relevant to Greeks. And he felt like a lot of it wasn't. And so he would make it relevant through allegorizing. But he also is important for us to understand at least some of the Jews of the 1st century. Let us look at apocalyptic for just a moment. The word apocalyptic can refer either to a kind of literature or a kind of eschatology. Now, in the Old Testament, of course, we have prophetic literature. Apocalyptic is also a kind of prophecy, but it's much different in style from that. The prophets of the Old Testament were preachers. They were preaching to people, and they were giving a message from God, thus saith the Lord, and very often it was a message of repent, change your ways, get back to keeping the law, love God, treat your neighbors the way you should, take care of the orphan and widow. It also saw God active in history, that God would work in history, and we could, through our prayers, through our righteous living, we could impact history, and that God would use history to finally bring in the day of the Lord, when God would intervene in history and set up the kingdom, a visible kingdom here on earth. Apocalyptic was different. Apocalyptic did not see God involved in history very much. The prophet said, repent, and God will intervene. The apocalyptic writers said, we've already repented and God hasn't intervened. Where is God? And so they had given up on God intervening in history. The apocalyptists were not preachers, they were writers. Okay? They were not preachers, they were writers. And very often their message came from visions. An angelic being would give them visions about the end time. And in apocalyptic, the imagery is very vivid. Seeing all kinds of beasts with heads and horns and all kinds of things like that. Now we have a little bit of that in the Old Testament, especially in Ezekiel and Daniel. But in the apocalyptic literature, it's there all over the place. And this really developed during the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we have only one book of the New Testament that is in an apocalyptic style, and that is the book of Revelation. All right. Our time is just about up. I think that in fact, there goes my alarm right now. So we will stop here. We will finish up Jewish background next time, and then we will get into the Greco-Roman background. Before we dismiss, does anybody have a question or comment?
Josephus and Philos are both Jews, eh?
That's
Is it?
right. They're
Thank you.
both first century Jews. That's right. Josephus and Philo.
So
Okay.
are we coming on here for class on Friday, or are we going on Moodle to do the exam?
You'll come here, and we're going to use both Zoom and Moodle.
Okay.
All right, so you'll need to log into both.
Both,
Okay, remember, next time we have a quiz, a 5-minute quiz. It won't take long, won't be very painful, and it'll be over, and then we'll go on. Okay?
Okay.
God bless you.
God bless you,
Thanks.
sir.
I'll see you on
Bye-bye.
Friday.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Yes,
Thank
thank you,
you.
classmates.
Dr.
Thank you.
Galen.
Dr. Galen.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. See you Friday.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Now.